Thank you so much for listening to American Medicine Today. I'm Kimberly Bonatti, joined by Ethan Euchre.
Glad to be here.
Yes, and our senior fellow, Jeff Wagstaff.
Hello, Kimberly, and thanks to everyone out there for listening.
Yes, and world-renowned orthopedic surgeon, Dr. Alfred Bonatti. Thank you
Hi,
for being
Senior.
So, a new book that explores a wide variety of medical curiosities throughout history has been called Delightfully Horrifying by Popular Science. And joining us to discuss is medical historian Thomas Morris, author of The Mystery of Exploding Teeth. Thank you for being here, Thomas.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Any book that's called Delightfully Horrifying, you got my interest right there.
You had him.
It's right up
me
my
too.
alley. So, Thomas, there's a lot of different anecdotes and stories in the book. Let's just start with the title. What is the mystery of the exploding teeth?
It's a case that took place in Pennsylvania just over 200 years ago. And actually, although it took place in 1817, it wasn't reported until about 40 years later in a publication called Dental Cosmos. And what happened was a clergyman who was based in Springfield, Pennsylvania, suddenly developed this excruciating toothache, and there's this great description of him running up and down like an enraged animal and kind of dunking his head under the water in his back garden to try and ease the pain. The pain didn't go away until the next morning when suddenly one of his teeth, the one that had been troubling him, exploded spontaneously. He said it gave a report like a pistol shot. That's a kind of strange story on its own, but it wasn't the only time it happened. The same dentist saw 3 patients who had pretty much identical symptoms. In one of them, the young woman who was affected said that when her tooth burst, it did so with an impact that well-nigh knocked her over. These are quite kind of dramatic explosions.
It literally exploded.
Well, that's the description. I mean, I've talked to some dentists, current dentists, about what they think might have happened here. And they're a bit skeptical about this. They think that maybe these teeth just kind of split in a painful way that felt like something more dramatic.
Maybe the dentist put some like gunpowder or something in the teeth.
It's a prank.
This is very odd.
Well, funnily enough, there is one theory which does involve exploding chemicals. In the late 19th century, where before the kind of current mercury amalgam filling materials came along, they experimented with all sorts of other materials. There are accounts from certainly later in the 19th century of dentists using these slightly unstable compounds, which, if they weren't treated carefully, could go off bang in their hands. So there is one kind of just about plausible theory that what was going on here was that they were using some sort of experimental compound to fill the teeth of these people, and they'd just been unlucky that it had sort of
Exploded.
deteriorated and eventually just exploded in their mouths.
So, Thomas, tell us about this other one. It's about an American sailor who would drunkenly swallow swords. Or knives, I should say.
This is an American sailor who was on a ship which had obviously sailed the Atlantic, and they were moored in northern France. And he and some of his shipmates went ashore. Inevitably, they got drunk, and while they were on shore, they watched a stage magician, a conjurer, and he had this stage trick which involved pretending to swallow penknives. Once they got back on board their ship, they carried on drinking. One of the sailors challenged another to repeat the trick they'd seen on stage.
I can do that. Hold my beer.
Exactly. Yeah, it's a scenario that Hold My Beer was invented for, this one.
Oh, no.
So he swallowed his own penknife, not kind of realizing that the stage magician had a trick. He wasn't actually swallowing these knives. He swallowed several more. And in fact, it was a trick he repeated a few times and then forgot about, and nothing bad happened, and the knives seemed to have traveled kind of straight through his digestive system and out the other end. And then about 10 years later, he bumped into one of these sailors he'd been with earlier, and they said, "Oh, do you still do that trick swallowing knives?" And on one occasion, he swallowed 14 knives in a sitting.
Oh my God.
And things weren't so bad at first, but, you don't swallow 14 knives without some sort of consequences. And eventually, he was admitted to hospital in London. But he was a bit of a mystery to doctors because they just didn't believe that he'd swallowed these knives. And it was, in fact, only when he died and they did an autopsy that they discovered the remnants of 37 knives, kind of clogging up his guts all the way from his stomach right down to his rectum.
So he didn't actually pass them. They
were
were
actually-
lodged inside him?
Well, the first few that he swallowed, yes, he passed them. And in fact, he said he could account for the first 6 or 7, I think. And then at some point, they started lodging at various points in his gut. And then once you got a blockage like that, it's much more difficult for other knives to pass through, obviously.
Oh, sure.
In fact, in the autopsy report, the doctors reported that his whole intestines had kind of gone this rusty colour because of the amount of iron that he had ingested.
Wow.
How does that come out without causing severe
Major
pain or just totally lacerating his intestines the whole time? I mean, what did him in is he was stupid enough to do it again.
These are kind of pen knives where the blade folds into the handle. And that's why he got away with it the first few times, that as long as they went through quite quickly, the blade remained kind of embedded in the handle. But later on, when there was a blockage, these knives are staying in for longer, and the handle, which is made of wood or ivory, would then get dissolved by the stomach acid. So then you've got the metal of the blade exposed, and then obviously it's much more dangerous. Yes, you lacerate the stomach, lacerate the small or large intestine. Very dangerous indeed.
Oh,
Thomas, tell us about the gentleman from London who had a horrible situation with frostbite.
This is the man who fell asleep in a puddle on a cold evening after drinking too much. I take it that's who you're referring to.
I'm sensing a theme here, Thomas, that booze is typically involved with these stories.
Yeah, a large proportion of these stories actually are to do with, young men's misadventures, drinking too much, getting into highly regrettable situations. But yes, he ended up needing both his legs amputated because he got frostbite. In fact, winters in London used to be much colder than they are today. This is in the 1820s or 30s. And yes, sadly, he woke up the next morning with frostbite, was told by the doctor that he'd need to have his legs amputated, which he did without anaesthetics. And this is the age before anaesthetics. And he seemed to have an incredible tolerance to pain, this man. So he sat there as the doctor sawed off his leg, and the only thing he said was, "Oh, it's sharp."
Can you imagine?
That's a sharp blade you got there, Doc.
Oh, maybe he took another swig to make that livable. I don't know. But then there was also a guy who had his brain severed by an axe.
And lived.
And he lived. Tell us about that.
In the 19th century, the doctors were really fascinated by the functions of the brain. They had, at that time, there were lots of competing theories about the brain, whether it was a single organ, whether there are different areas of the brain that did different things, and if so, how you could kind of localize which bits of the brain did what. So brain injuries were a subject of enormous fascination to 19th century medics. And there are actually a whole number of these reports from 19th century journals. But this one in particular, a young man had, this is an accident in a mill. I mean, this is a straightforward industrial accident. And he was hit with an axe and lost a large portion of the bones of his skull, but also, what's described as quite a large portion of brain. And to the amazement of the doctor who treated him, when he didn't really do anything except place this kind of flap of bone back on the guy's head with its kind of accompanying brain tissue. And to everybody's amazement, he made a full recovery.
Wow.
Unreal. Well, I'm sure his personality was completely different. There's stories like that, too.
Except that he suffered from splitting headaches.
Oh. All right, get out of the studio. Turn his mic off. Hey, we're out of time. So
Thank you for being on the show to discuss these medical marvels. We have medical historian Thomas Morris, author of The Mystery of the Exploding Teeth. That has got to be a fascinating read. Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for being on the program.
Thank you.
You're listening to American Medicine Today.